So, welcome back, everybody, and thank you for attending Climbing the Ladder in Hybrid Environments. Before we get started, we do need to go over some general housekeeping. So, if you have any questions throughout the session, please share them in the chat box to your right under Q&A, and the speakers will provide practical answers at the end. This session will be recorded and made available on demand on the BYP Network conference site. I will now hand over to Priscilla, Head of Audit for Group and Divisional Operations and Payments, and Andrew, an Analyst, Special Situations Group at Credit Suisse. Welcome, Priscilla and Andrew. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. Nice to see our more professional photos above the handle as well. As you can tell, I'm sitting in my flat in a much more kind of casual manner and demeanor. So hopefully that's okay. So. I suppose that leads quite nicely onto today's event and subject matter, which is climbing the ladder in a hybrid environment. So I think the idea today is that we have half an hour for what I hope can be a useful, productive, and insofar as technology allows us, an interactive session. So please do drop questions into the Q&A and I'll pick them up and we'll try to engage with those as much as we can. And I think the aim is really just to grapple with and share our tips and tricks in relation to advancing one's career, but doing so in the context of an ever-changing digital working environment. So with that, as Ruth mentioned, my name is Andrew O'Flaherty. I'll be your co-coordinator for today's session. I'm an analyst in Credit Suisse's Special Situations investing team based in London, and we essentially buy and sell mainly debt of highly leveraged companies around the world. I've been at CS for 3 years. So far they haven't managed to get rid of me. And I'm also at Credit Suisse beyond my day job, a member of Credit Suisse's BAME network, and I work within a subcommittee that is focused on talent acquisition and works very closely with campus recruiting. I am joined in today's conversation by my wonderful co-conversationalist Priscilla. Priscilla Lutalo. Briefly on Priscilla, I'll let her say more about herself. But Priscilla is a managing director at Credit Suisse, working within internal audit. Her background includes auditing multiple areas across the bank, but in particular, the investment bank and chief financial office. She has worked across a number of Credit Suisse offices. I think she just got back from Switzerland, but over her career, she has spent time in the US, both New York and North Carolina. And her current role today is head of audit for operations globally. Outside of her day job, if I can call it that, Priscilla is active in a lot of the broader Credit Suisse community initiatives. And I'd say one of her key commitments is as a co-chair of the BAME network, where, as you can imagine, she's deeply focused on issues of representation and diversity. I believe it's 14 years now at Credit Suisse, Priscilla. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll pause there. But is there anything you'd like to add to your own profile?
No, nothing aside from the fact that I'm really happy to be here. I think this is a very important topic, and I hope what we discuss today will be really relevant to the audience.
Absolutely. Okay, well, fantastic. Well, look, very keen, guys, for it to be as interactive as possible. So please do drop any questions, thoughts, comments in the comments box, and we will definitely endeavor to engage with them. I guess I'll start, Priscilla, by really making the most banal and obvious comment, which is that in many ways, the world of work in the last 2 years has changed. Previously, particularly in industries such as investment banking, if I can say so, working from home was perhaps, shall we say, associated with non-work or not working. And I know for me in my career, the concept of FaceTime and being seen to be doing and being seen to be busy may have been relevant. But now, in a sense, by default and by design of the last 2 years, these dynamics have changed, and perhaps that's on a permanent basis. And so with that in mind, Priscilla, you are someone who's experienced flexible work, as well as having worked in multiple jurisdictions and geographies at Credit Suisse at a very senior level. So, in a nutshell, what is your experience of flexible working today? Is it something that you're enjoying, the changing way we work, and the move from physical to virtual working?
I think that's an excellent opening question. And I think my experience of being a person who worked flexibly probably started maybe on an ad hoc basis a couple of years before the big pandemic, but really kicked in during the pandemic. But as a manager, I've been offering flexible working for some time. And I do remember situations when it was really something that we had to kind of explain and really reiterate to people that it had value and that the people who partook of it were equally valuable to the organization. And that wasn't because of any particular individual, but it's just what society thought at the time. And my view is that working from home or flexible working is a great leveler. And the reason I say that is, although a year ago we started working from home out of fear, it has become something that, people want to have access to on an ongoing basis going forward. We must really accept that we've entered into a new paradigm. And it is a way of, I think, ensuring that we can in some ways retain our talent, make sure that we can have that ongoing commitment and that people can actually give their best selves to our work, to our organizations. And I think, particularly for me, what I think that this has also meant, particularly when we were forced into the flexible working state, is that there's been a better balance between career progression through relationships and career progression through outcomes. You can't be successful working from home without results. And where outcomes are the primary driver, there's really nowhere to hide, and then people get recognized more for what they do than whom they know. It means that you can have better access to the talent and employees because people don't only think of distance when factoring in their place of work. So it really works for me. I think it's something that we should accept is here to stay. And if we want to make sure that we can retain the top talent, the best individuals, we have to be open to it.
Got it. No, that's I understand. It's fascinating, especially this idea that you can look so much more broadly for talent around the world because we are not, in a sense, limited by the fixed proximity. So no, that's well understood. I guess while you were speaking, I was thinking one of the key things with remote working, one of the challenges is this idea of isolation and solitude. This idea that perhaps we don't have the same level of connectivity with managers, other reports or employees, even clients. If I think about myself personally, I still feel a little bit of this imposter syndrome when I'm sitting at home quietly working on my own accord. That little voice in your head which says, because someone can't see me working, am I really working? I was thinking of what's the kind of philosophy question that everyone gets? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? And I almost think it sometimes with work, it's like, well, if I work 10 to 12 hours a day, but no one sees me working, am I really getting anything done? So I guess with that in mind, my question is almost, how can someone who is working remotely or working flexibly show their manager that they're still hardworking and say not just having fun or enjoying life too much? And and I'm interested, Priscilla, in your view there, both as someone who has people that you report into at the exec board level, but at the same time manages a staff and is a mentor to people who are more junior in the firm.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think that is probably, you've really expressed one of the biggest barriers to working in a hybrid environment. It's that fear that it's going to be a disadvantage to career development. And I think it's really going to take a cultural shift to
Right.
for us as managers to measure outcomes more than we measure, I guess, time at a desk. It's really about, I think, communicating results. And I think it's really, something that's very important that people who do choose to work in a hybrid environment must recognize that, you have to make it very, very obvious that there's no distinction between you and others when it comes in terms of value. And if you happen to be an introverted person, that means
Yes.
you may have to step out of your shell and communicate differently with your managers. And when I say communicate differently, it's not only just telling them when you've had a success, it's also telling them when you've overcome a challenge. So they can see that in the periods where you may not be actively producing, that you are actually putting in a substantial amount of effort. I also think it's important that people who do work in a hybrid environment maintain relationships very proactively. There is obviously the state that you won't be able to encounter people at a water cooler. You won't be able to kind of show them who you are by being able to discuss your random conversations on the basis that, often what you see is that, most conversations are pre-scheduled and they have a specific agenda. So I think what is very important for people who work in a hybrid environment to do is to make sure that they actively try and connect with others, that they establish correlations, commonalities, and leverage those going forward. As managers, indeed, that's particularly important because you won't know how your team is doing unless you can actually communicate with them and notice. And what I've found as a manager is that the level of escalation has probably reduced when people work in a hybrid environment because they often wait for an appointment to express that there's a problem. And it's really about continually expressing that, your door is open, give people multiple routes to escalation, and more importantly, really empower people to make decisions on their own and in a safe way so that you don't become a form of bottleneck to their progress and success. So I think a combination of those things means that people can continue to be successful in their role, but I really think it requires a shift in behaviors from both the individual and the manager in order to make sure that those lines of communication are maintained.
Do you think, just thinking aloud as you say that, do you think that it's, and I know we've got a lot of people on the call who are, explore at the beginning of their careers, whether that's in finance or financial services or with corporations, business in general. Do you think that it is harder to be a manager in the current circumstances, in the sense that, you mentioned, for example, building that personal connectivity in the absence of the water cooler moment where there are those opportunities to just say, how are you? And there isn't that, I suppose, intentionality. We are on this call to discuss X, for example. So yeah, how as you as a manager do you kind of deal with that? Is it a case of reaching out more to people who report into you and kind of maybe a bit more mechanically saying how are you via Skype or picking up the phone? Yeah, I'm just curious to how, as a manager, you have that connectivity has shifted.
Well, what I've done as a manager in particular is try to make sure that the hierarchies don't become a barrier to communication. I think that historically, particularly, if you look maybe 20 years ago when I started working, it was very, very clear that access was something that you earned to talk to certain people. And,
right.
And actually that's a disadvantage to the manager now because you won't know how your team is doing. So it's really about trying to reduce those barriers, scheduling virtual lunches. The meeting is scheduled, not jumping straight into the agenda, but spending some time asking people how they're doing and finding that personal connection point. It's about your camera on as well. It sounds so simple,
yes.
But as humans, what we do is we read body language just as much as we hear words. And I think with with body language in particular, it enables us to things like detect worry, detect deceit, detect a multitude of things. And it's very, very important in order to establish confidence in your ability or trust that you have that camera on, because that's going to convey subliminal messages to your manager, which you'll never be able to portray in words. And continuing on that vein, in terms of messaging, communicating by email is also a challenge, because you can't convey a lot of things in email. And if you limit your communications to just email, you're likely to be misunderstood, because there's a lot of ambiguity there. So what I would recommend is people give very, very clear emails. If anything, they can express their sentiment more in emails. I'm not talking about use of emojis. I'm just really talking about really being clear. And if an email, if an email conversation requires discussion, I would really suggest you pick up the phone, and that's how best to be effective in a hybrid environment.
It's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking, particularly this point about putting the camera on. I think especially in the early days of working remotely and moving into the beginnings of the pandemic, when actually say we were forced into that environment through it, effectively fear and the uncertainty around the future. I remember everyone kind of saying, well, I'm not going on camera because I'm having a bad hair day, and there would always be reasons for people to not in a sense be visible, even though previously when you go into work everyone sees you and what you look like, and you do have those sub communications that are non-verbal which matter to just relate to people, but also in important decision making in the corporate environment. So it's interesting that we've moved from that, and as you were mentioning that idea of putting the video on, I was thinking, probably a few months ago now, my own team and I didn't have some of the video virtual calls for the first few months, and because we were used to normally, if we just were working remotely pre-pandemic, just to have a call and or just dial into the call. But I think after a while and really not having that physical ability to see someone's reaction, we said, oh, why don't we all just jump on a video call and actually see everyone? And it must have been 3 or 4 months into lockdown in the UK, and I think everyone was so relieved to just see that everyone was still there and still present. And one of the things for me that was interesting was, not in this room, this is my boring study, but I did a call in my kitchen, and I had a bunch of bottles of wine behind me, and one of the salespeople who I knew relatively well said, oh, what's that behind you? And just said, oh, it's red wine. And so since then we've gone back into the office and struck up a bit of a dialogue and conversation about our common interest in wines. And I think one thing of a virtual that I didn't appreciate was it's also this humanizing element. There's a sense of you actually, in a sense, you are in a way letting people into your own home that otherwise wouldn't be in that environment. And yes, it's professional and focused around a common goal and team objectives, but I think having that that living room connectivity is also a positive, and for me that was somewhat unexpected. So yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. Having a video when you're virtual, I think is important as well. I guess moving slightly on, and guys, again, please do chip in with comments and questions. Keen to get your sense of this debate as well, and your experiences. But I guess a slightly new direction, Priscilla, is, do you think it's bad for one's career to want to work remotely? I mean, you mentioned the word introvert earlier in your earlier comments, and I wonder if one should feel a certain kind of way, i.e. that one is less valuable if you do want a remote working job or do want to spend more days working from home. How do you, even as a senior manager, when people come to you and say, I want to work from home, how do you reflect on that? And is the desire to work from home a bad thing?
I think that is a very interesting question, and I think it really depends. It depends on the role, and it depends on the individual. I think in some cases, even where you can have scenarios where people may be working from home or maybe working flexibly, you may have a view as a manager that, particularly for a new joiner, that's not maybe an option you want to give them initially until you see how things go.
Got it.
I think that, as far as, your question around, does it, I mean, is there anything negative around it? I think we all have a responsibility to our organizations to make sure that the outcomes and the objectives of each respective area are aligned with. And there will be certain cases where, that human contact is necessary. For example, in my view, I don't think you can have a difficult conversation with a regulator or with an individual about their performance. I don't think you should do that remotely if you have the option of doing it in person.
Right.
So I do think there's scenarios where you might, as a manager, insist that there be some form of a face-to-face interaction. But I think where, individuals would essentially be coming into the office to sit on Zoom calls all day, I think we should be a lot more open, and I think we should apply common sense and judgment. And you'll see that organizations will be very, very different. And I think that, there are very strong reasons to have people in the office as well, particularly when it comes to training and development. There's, a view that, particularly when people are learning, you don't just learn from a textbook, you learn by being able to reach over to your manager and, ask them a question, show them your screen. And my view is that when it comes to, working in office, it's got to be something that is of value just as much as working from home could be of value to someone. I think a strong manager can really realistically tempt people to want to come into the office, to interact, to socialize, to learn, to train, to escalate, to attend, networking events. And I definitely think that, each area needs to find the right balance and also be able to measure outcomes very well. And some of that outcome measurement, particularly in jobs like sales, are best measured when people can actually observe others in action. I see a question here around apps and tools that one would recommend for better collaboration and communication. I don't think we would endorse any individual, app or tool, but I think what is probably I would like to maybe mention is the functionality within those tools, which I think you might want to look for. Ideally, you would want to have a tool that enables some form of video sharing, video conferencing, not only of the interactions of participants, but also sharing materials and people able to see the same screen. Ideally, if you do have that option and you can create in that same format, that would be even better, because some of the most important discussions in one area where I still like to do a lot of in-person teamwork is around brainstorming, because brainstorming, for example, works best when everybody is feeding off each other's ideas and not kind of, having those delays between emails to communicate how a strategy is going to be developed. So I think if you can look for apps and tools that can incorporate both, or at least one of those, then I do think that can really be a way forward.
Priscilla, are we getting more questions? I don't think I can see the Q&A, but guys, if there are more, please do shout. But I didn't see that last one flagged.
I'm sort of answering them as I see them on the side, and thank you very much, those of you who have sent questions in. That's really helpful. But we have about 6 minutes left. Andrew, I don't know if you had any additional questions for me, because I'd obviously love to share a bit more. Just before you do, there's one particular piece when it comes to promotability and career development. One tip that I always have is to make sure that you keep a file of your results and outcomes, because they're not going to be necessarily as visible. So if you can store that information, and I like to store that in an email folder because it often comes through in an email folder, good feedback that you get, good information, things that you've produced. Store that in a folder so that when your manager asks for updates, you can actually share those materials with your manager and they have more confidence. It's not just taking your word for it. It's getting endorsements from other people that you're networking with in your roles.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the digital paper trail is sometimes such a huge benefit. I mean, I even have on my email a folder which is something like positive feedback, and every email that I get, which is praise or even a boss saying, "Oh, good job, Andrew," or something like that, or a young person who's got some advice or feedback that they found useful. I just throw it in there, and when it's come to things like promotions. And that process, having that resource there, that digital resource has been hugely valuable. So yeah, having those tools available for when you need them, I think is hugely valuable. I see one question here, and we've probably got a chance for two more, but I'll just read this one out. How do you handle performance How do you handle performance issues in a remote environment? I guess a follow-up would be, and Priscilla, chip in, please. But what do you mean by performance issues? Yeah, maybe clarify that a little bit.
I think I know what.
Yeah.
Yeah, people not being able to do their jobs well in a remote environment. And I think that's a really, really relevant question. And I'm going to talk about it from two perspectives. One is if you're the manager of someone who's underperforming, I would really say that conversation is not via email. That is one of those occasions where you will want to have as much in person as you can acquire. And the question that one must ask first is not to blame, not to criticize, but always to say, what's going on? How are you? Because that's when the person may be most ready to let you know the true problem so that you can really address that rather than being defensive and then you arguing as to whether or not there's anything to do. Definitely from that perspective, it's about really pushing for that human-to-human connection and really starting with the open questions. If you as an individual feel that you're underperforming, it's best to always check in with your manager and clarify expectations. Just to check in and say, I think I can only get this to you Friday. Is that okay? That is a much better conversation to have with your manager than it to come to Thursday and they ask you where that deliverable is.
Yes.
About that continuous back and forth. And if there's additional things that are coming up that are impacting you, trying to be transparent, not in a way of making excuses, but coming up with a solution as to how you're going to get to the end point anyway. Yeah.
Fantastic. We have 2 minutes left. Thank you so much, Priscilla and BYP for putting us on. It's been an enjoyable chat. I guess, maybe to tie up, I think you mentioned at the start, Priscilla, we feel it's very much here to stay, the hybrid environment. Any kind of final tips for everyone in terms of navigating this new working model?
Yes, final tip, and it's very important, is if you do have the luxury of being able to work flexibly, please be responsible about it. These things are very often offered because they are, not abused. So think about it as like, the new paper in a public facility. It's free to everybody, but if everybody started to steal those loo rolls, they'd probably lock it away and charge people. So if you do have the benefit of working in an organization that gives you that permission, please make sure that you work hard and you make sure that those opportunities remain available to those that will come after you.
Fantastic. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much, Priscilla. Thank you, BYP and Ruth, for putting this on. And it's been a pleasure. Looking forward to staying in touch. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.